Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our second session in the Data to Decisions series, Data Quality. We're coming to you from Memorial University in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm Mandy Strickland, Program Coordinator at the Harris Center, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all today. Just to let you know, today's session is being recorded and will be available later on both the Harris Center's website and YouTube channels. And if you missed our first session, you could also watch that one there as well. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on these lands and the land where you are located today, and to consider the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territory. In case you're new to the series, the Regional Analytics Lab, or RAN Lab, as we like to call it, is the Data and Analytics Unit of Memorial University's Harris Center. RAN Lab analyzes data with geography to provide insight into and projection modeling for things like demographics, labor supply, service demands, commodity prices, and other socioeconomic indicators. Some examples of their work include producing long-term regional population projections, assessing local housing demand, and providing detailed local data and analysis to municipalities and regions, providing critical information for evidence-based decision-making. We'd also like to thank one of our sponsors for the series, the Future Skills Center. The center is a federally funded initiative that is committed to having all Canadians, from employees to employers, understand and access what skills will be needed for the future labor market. And really, we can't think of anything that's more representative of future than data integration into everything we do. Data collection and availability has been a hallmark of the technological advances of the past few decades. And today it's relatively easy to find data on just about anything you could be looking for. Data is collected in such quantities and it's so universal. It's just everywhere. But how do you know what data is right for your needs? In this session, you'll learn how to assess data quality to avoid errors or misinterpretations in your work. Through the session and through the series, we hope to make understanding and using data in your daily life a little simpler. So to get us started, I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Megan Ivner, Policy Analyst with RAN Lab. Then following Megan's presentation, we'll have a 15-minute Q&A session with Jamie Ward, Manager of RAN Lab. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to send us your questions using the Q&A or chat functions. And over to you, Megan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today is our second presentation in the Data to Decisions series. Our last presentation was on data and geography, and today I'm going to be talking about data quality. So I will just jump right in. When collecting and using data, it's really important to be aware of any issues that may impact the quality and therefore the interpretation of the data you're using. Some of the most common data quality issues include data availability, consistency, and accuracy. Now, there are countless criteria you can use to assess the quality of your data, but these tend to be the most common, and so that's what I'm going to focus on today. So it's important to conduct quality control checks on the data collected and to document any issues identified along with any actions taken to rectify these issues to ensure that analysis and interpretation is as transparent as possible. And when you collect a data set, there are some things you can look out for to help you identify any potential issues with data quality. And these include things like big shifts in data, outlier data points, and any breaks or gaps in the data. So I'm going to take you through some examples of these data quality issues today in this presentation. So we'll start with data availability. Data availability can vary over time, geography, sources, and topics. For example, a data set from a survey introduced in the 80s may not exist prior to that time period, simply because the data hadn't been collected before then, and therefore is unavailable. The format in which data is available can also change over time. An example of this is recent StatsCan data is available online for download straight into a usable format. But some of the older historical data, like historical census data, for example, is only available in scanned PDF format. So this can make data collection and use challenging. Also, data privacy and confidentiality requirements as mandated by the Statistics Act can impact data availability, as it requires data at specific levels to be suppressed and therefore unavailable. So these types of availability issues can lead to gaps in data sets. And if a gap is relatively small, it may be possible to estimate by making an assumption about what the data within the gap looks like. The process of filling in a data gap using an assumption is called interpolation. And to do this, the interpolation assumption must be reasonable, defensible, and well documented, meaning you can't just make up any assumption you want. It needs to be grounded in research, evidence, literature. So I'm going to go through an example of how to fill in a missing year of data using a few different interpolation methods. I will mention I'm not going to go through the details of how to calculate these estimates, but that information will be available in the documentation that's going to accompany this presentation. So you can see below here, we have a data set with a missing year of data. So the first method of trying to estimate this missing year of data would be the 2-point average. And this is where you would take the average of the 2 data points on either side of the missing year to calculate the missing values. So in this example, you would take the average of the 2006 and 2008 data, and that would result in an estimate of 419 for this data set. Another method is the average annual percentage change, and this is when you calculate the percentage change for each year in the data set and then take the average of those calculations to estimate the missing year of data. And this approach would result in an estimate of 422. And another approach would be the straight line percentage change. And this is where you calculate a single percentage change over the entire time period based on the first and last year of data in the data set. And then you would divide that percentage change by the number of years in the data set. And that would result in an estimate of 421. So how do you know which method, which interpolation method to use? That depends on the characteristics of your data set. So the straight line method works well with consistent data that follows a predictable pattern, making it reasonable to assume that the annual percentage change over time is relatively stable. The average annual percentage approach may better reflect changes within a data set that's less consistent, but still pretty predictable, meaning there are no big outlier data points or big shifts in the data. And then the 2-point average approach may best work with more volatile data that follows a less predictable pattern in order to capture year-to-year changes. So now we'll move on to data consistency, and consistency issues can occur when collecting data from different sources, jurisdictions, and time periods. It's really important to look at the definition of the data sets being collected in order to determine if they are comparable and can be used as a valid, consistent data set. So For example, let's say you've collected data sets called net debt from multiple jurisdictions in order to conduct a comparative analysis. But each jurisdiction actually defines net debt differently, and therefore these data sets aren't comparable apples to apples. This is an example of the definitions of a data set being inconsistent across jurisdictions. So one way you can identify issues with data consistency is to look for big shifts in data. So I have a hypothetical example here of a population data for town X, and you can see the data is relatively stable for several years. Then there's a big jump, and then the data becomes stable again at this new level. So a big shift like this needs to be examined in order to understand what's happening with the data. So what happened in 2013 to cause this shift in the population in town X? A jump in population could be explained by several reasons. In this hypothetical example, the data shift is explained by the fact that town X amalgamated with neighboring town Y in 2013. So town X kept its name, but absorbed the population from the next town over. And this would be an example of the definition or the boundaries of town X changing. And that is what explains this big shift in data. And now we will move on to data accuracy. And this is the degree to which data correctly describes what it is designed to measure. So data accuracy can become an issue if errors are made when entering, copying, converting, or transferring data. And when errors occur in data, it may no longer be a reliable source of information. And an example of human error resulting in data accuracy could be just like a simple typo when transferring data from one source or format to another. And data accuracy errors can often show up as outliers in a data set. So here's an example here of a data set with an outlier data point. You can see that all data points except for Newfoundland follow a similar pattern. And an outlier data point like this should be researched to see if this is a mistake or an error, or if it's accurately representing what it's meant to measure. So in this case, was the data for Newfoundland and Labrador simply incorrectly entered into the database, or was something actually happening in this province at the time that resulted in a significantly higher data point than the rest of the country? So these are the types of questions and answers you want to be thinking about when you spot an outlier data point in your data set. So once you've done your quality control check on your data and you're ready to use it, you also need to make sure you're using it appropriately. One of the most common issues that arises from the inappropriate use of data is called the ecological fallacy. Now, there are several spatial fallacies that can occur through the inappropriate use of data, but the ecological fallacy tends to be the most common, and so that's what I'm going to focus on here. So the ecological fallacy is an error that occurs when conclusions about individuals are drawn based on aggregate data. And assuming that what is true for a group is also true for individual members within that group can result in misleading data analysis and interpretation. So a common occurrence of this error is when provincial data is applied to local geographies. So I'm going to go through an example now using real data. So from 2006 to 2016, the province of Newfoundland and Labrador experienced slow growth, with the total population increasing only 3% over that 10-year time period. However, the Avalon Peninsula experienced 9% population growth over that time frame, and the St. John's population actually grew 14%. Meanwhile, the population on the Northern Peninsula declined by 14%. So this example shows how provincial data may not accurately reflect the more nuanced experiences of smaller geographic areas within the province. So just to wrap up, some key things to take away from the presentation. Big shifts in data, outlier data points, breaks or gaps in the data are all clues to potential data quality issues. So if something looks off, investigate it. And documenting data quality issues and actions taken to rectify these issues is imperative to open, transparent, defensible analysis. You want to document everything. And finally, good quality data needs to be applied appropriately. So the inappropriate use of data can result in misleading analysis and conclusions. So that concludes the presentation on data quality. Like always, if you have any questions or any follow-ups, do not hesitate to contact myself or Jamie. And now we will have some time for questions and answers. Thank you so much.
All right, we're just going to jump in and see if there are any questions. Take a look at the Q&A. So our first question is, let's see. How do you know when there may be data quality issues when collecting data from a source like StatsCan?
Jamie, do you want to take that one or should I?
You can take that one if you like.
Okay, so StatsCan has a process set up for assessing all of their data. They have a pretty detailed set of data quality criteria that they go through and a quality assurance process. And what they will do is when they make their data available to the public, they'll flag any data sets or data points that may require attention. So they'll flag some data as suppressed due to confidentiality requirements. Some data they may flag as being reliable, or they'll specifically say to use caution if you're going to use this data because of potential data quality issues. So StatsCan is really good at documenting and flagging any data that may have any sort of quality issues associated with it.
Yeah, for sure. I think too, if I can add, you'll notice when you're clicking around Stats Canada sometimes, you're looking at data, they'll have the little flags, A, B, C, D, or whatever the letters up there. And if you click on the letters, it'll tell you sort of the depth of some of the response rate issues or data issues and whatnot. So just get your hands dirty and get in there.
Great. Okay, we've got another question. Are there any rules or recommendations about when data shifts or outliers exist and should or shouldn't be used? If you find a shift in data that seems very odd and you can't seem to find the cause, is it better to proceed or perhaps reconsider your analysis?
Well, I think I just got to reiterate, the starting part of that is, you really have to try to connect. If you're dealing with data in your community or in an area, it's really important, I always find, to not ignore your gut and to try to, to place it. You have to try to figure out why. That's before you can ignore anything, before you can discard a point, you have to know why it's there. Is it an error? Is it someone had a missing keystroke? Or is it representative of actual real world phenomenon? I've always sort of believed that, and have been led to believe that if you have something that you can't rule out that it's legitimate, you have to include it, So yeah, so you just go back to brass tacks, and there's always different ways too of getting to the bottom of this. There's different tools, and sometimes you might not just have the data in front of you, as Megan mentioned in the presentation. A lot of times these data sets will come with documentation, metadata, and run through that. That might tell you something. You might be able to get hints in there about how the data was gathered. If it's maybe it had a very small response rate or something. I mean, these are things. Even when you get beyond Stats Canada, these are good curiosities to have, to look at that. But that is the most important thing. Whenever you're dealing with these things, data in general, you want to treat it not like it's an abstract other thing. You really want to try to get in touch with it. You really want to understand what's going on, because it's reflecting it's generally a reflection of some real world phenomenon, something that is happening by people or animals or something, something that's happening. And so yeah, really want to use whatever you have really to rule that out first. That's the most important thing.
Thanks, Jamie. We have another question, which seems sort of like, in addition to that sort of question, is that we talked a little bit about fitness of use for data points, but what if a downloaded data set has a missing data point that doesn't fall within the timeline of what is relevant to my project? For example, if I'm only working with data from 2015 to 2020 and the missing data point is from 2014, is it okay to ignore this gap, or should I look at it from the perspective of the entire data set?
Well, I think to some extent that really depends on what you're doing. But I mean, if you're good with filters and everything in Excel or whatever, you can always, you can very technically remove those years, whatever, if you're focusing on a particular time frame. I mean, for sure. Just,
I think a kind of general rule of thumb is, if you have questionable data, you'll end up with questionable results. Like, you really want to understand the data that's going into your analysis so you can understand the results. And if there are questions about the data going into it, then there'll be questions about the results and sort of the robustness of the results and the defensiveness of the results. So again, like I said in the presentation, if there are questions, if something looks off, if something looks strange, do your best to try to understand what's going on, because that's going to help you with the interpretation of your results.
All right, great. Well, I'll just do one last call for questions. If anyone has a question they want to ask, please send it through the chat function in the next few seconds. Otherwise, we maybe can do a wrap up shortly. Oh, maybe we do have one question. So I research ocean harvesting policy. DFO bases their harvest rules on data collected over decades. It is often sparse, has high error, and varies drastically over time. As a result, DFO uses models to arrive at specific TACs. Those quotas are often at variance with harvesters' real experiences. What are your suggestions on how to address this?
Okay, well, I can say I don't have direct experience working with DFO or even a lot of natural sort of observation data like that, but a document, I mean, you should be able to, you really want to get to a place where you can articulate the weakness of this particular data set. So if you have a data set that you're using, for policy reasons or to make a decision or to influence something one way or another, you really want to understand, okay, where is this strong, where is this weak, and why. You should be able to, to work with people or to find some documentation somewhere about, if they're using these interpolation models to determine these things. You should be able to find established sort of peer-reviewed documentation about in the form of a paper or textbook or something, of that would give you hints about what situations is this applicable for, and what situations is it not applicable for. But yeah, no, I mean, the other thing is, in that particular case, you want to document the harvester's real experiences as well, because then then you can compare, how is it different, where is it different. And you really want to be aiming at a spot to be able to have a discussion and to encourage the discussion more. I think a lot of the times data or analysis, especially when it gets very tangly, can be used to shut down discussions. But I mean, that's really not the intent, I don't think, and that's not its best use. So I'd have to see that specific data set where it comes from before I can comment directly. But I know in general, I've dealt with a lot of sketchy data over the years with different things here and there, and really, I mean, you treat it with kid gloves, as they say. If it's you need to have the parameters in place so that you can evaluate the strength and the weaknesses, and you can know the extent to which you can apply it. If you think that there's something that's being over applied, that's being applied beyond what it's useful for, then I mean, being able to dive into the data and into the models used to generate the data, so you can tell its strengths and weaknesses, then you're getting somewhere. Then the discussion can go from there.
All right, great. Well, thank you. That seems like probably all the questions. Thank you, Jamie and Megan. Be sure to stay tuned for our future sessions on data. We will be having one in early 2022 on data collection. We'll also be sending out some accompanying materials in the near future, so keep an eye out for those. I've sent a link in the chat for everyone. If you could take a few seconds to answer a few short questions about the session today, your feedback will help us plan those future sessions. But to wrap up, thanks to the team at the Harris Center for pulling the session together. And of course, once again, our sponsor, Future Skills Center, for helping make this possible. And of course, thank you all for attending. We look forward to hearing from you, and we'll see you at the next session.